Hello and welcome back to the shed. In today's episode we're going to be restoring this Stanley No. 5 made in Australia. So what I've done here is just laid out some plastic and a bit of newspaper just so I don't make the bench dirty. Now there are a couple of different ways that you can remove the rust and restore a plan such as this. Sandpaper, that's my preferred method. The other option is you can take it all apart and put the metal parts in a vinegar bath and leave that for about 12 to 24 hours, then clean it all back. So I'm going to start here and I'll use a screwdriver. Just make sure you get a screwdriver that fits your screws properly. It's kind of important. Now I just like to loosen the screw on the cap iron because sometimes you'll find they're pretty strong or done up too tight. So we'll just remove cap iron, blade and chip breaker, and again it's important that we actually match the screws that are down in here. So we'll bring the screwdriver right down, fit them into these screws, and if they're nice and tight we'll be able to remove them without burying them at all. And just be careful when you take these screws off. If you look here, there's just a little wash on them. You don't want to lose that washer. And we'll take the adjustment little screw off here. That's reverse thread, so remember that when you're undoing it. I will also take this one out. This is the little screw here that holds this little adjuster, which situates on this screw here so you can move the throttle back and forwards. I'll take that one out. Sometimes a magnetic part spin's not a bad idea, but we'll just take this. Is where you want to be careful because these top little screws in the top of the handle here can be brass, so they'll be very soft, so that's another reason to make sure your screwdriver actually matches the thread. So we'll take all of this off, and sometimes these screws are a little hard to get off, so I'll just grab a pair of pliers and grab it in the middle here, just give it an extra little twist and it comes on. And again we've got the same problem with this being stuck, so just use the pliers right in the middle and just give it a little twist and then they'll normally come straight out. And last of all was that little frog adjustment screw I told you about. And we will also take apart the blade and chip breaker. It's a good time to actually have a look at this to see if there's a lot of rust. If you see just down here on this one, there's actually someone's put a really heavy back bevel on this, so when it comes to regrind out, which I'll do in the next video to show you how to sharpen them, we will actually take that off first. And although dirty, the back of the chip breaker is. So now we'll start looking at this and we'll just clean all this dirt out. So pretty much the first step is to go around and clean all the dirt out. If you think that the Japanning is in pretty good state, I wouldn't go heavy on it. I'd just scrub it out. This has lost most of its paint. So I will probably just scrape a lot of this off, scrape the rust out where I can, and repaint it. With the handles, the side of an old chisel or a card scraper is actually good for taking off this the old handle coatings on these, which is normally shellac. So what I'll do is I'll go ahead and I'll show you the setup that I'm going to do to start cleaning all of this up. Okay, so what I'm going to do here is I'll start with some 120 grit sandpaper. Now, doing it this way is messy, and it's important to wear an apron because you will get quite dirty doing it. It's a pretty simple process, really. Just get a piece, fold it up, start working and keep rotating until you've removed all your rust. Now, so I normally take these back until they're bare metal. I mean, if they've got a little bit of darker marks there, you can remove them if you really want to, but really the aim here is just to remove the rust. I find after you've done this, you go through with the 240 after that, and that seems to give you the same sort of luster that a lot of the modern planes get after they've been off their milling machines. You can also buy, I think from Lee Nielsen, they sell these little sanding blocks that have the grit right through them, so you could use them as well. But I'd use the sandpaper to remove the rust first. That's what it looks like after I've just been over with the 120, and then I'll go with the 240, but I'll go with the 120 around and clean everything else up first, and then we'll come back. I will also just take the rust off the bottom, but that'll be flattened later on after I've painted it. I'm going to move to a little bit of steel wool, and this is where I'll use a little bit of methylated spirits, and we'll clean up this Japanning and see what state it's in. So what I do now that I've cleaned it up as best as I'm going to clean it up, if you're painting it, you'd set it aside, make sure it's fully dry, and give it 3 or 4 light coats. First of all, I'm just going to show you how I clean the rest of them up. Blades, chip breaker, we just do what we have done, and we'll clean up the frog, blade, chip breaker, and the cap iron. The cap iron, I like to be a little more careful with. Just use some steel wool, because these are chrome plated, and if you put the sandpaper on it, you're going to take all that plating off. Now that I've done that, that's how it looks. You can see it's shined right up. You can just buff. There's bits of rust around the place. I find it doesn't matter too much here, unless you want to strip the whole thing back. This is as far as I go. I will then just use some paste wax. This is just beeswax, 5 parts linseed oil. And because this is as far as I'm going to go on this, I'm going to put this coating on here now to prevent it wanting to further rust, now that I've cleaned it up. Now I'm going to move on to cleaning up the frog. So what I'm going to do here is I'll go straight to the 240. Now, because on a lot of these parts the machining wasn't perfect, sanding it will completely flatten things out. So in some cases, if you just want to remove the rust, steel wool works better because it pushes into the little gaps that are there. It's an old tool, it doesn't have to be perfectly shiny. You get the majority of the rust off so it doesn't continue rusting. When the frog goes in, it rests on this area here, this metal area, and on these 2 edges here. So you want to make sure that all of this is clean of rust and these are clean of rust. Now when we set up for the flattening, I will actually rub this on the flat spot, or you can use a file. I'm going to show you flattening this piece in through here. So you can hold it flat, make sure the file reference is right on the flat, hold it nice and tight. So what I'm looking for here doesn't necessarily need to be flat all the way around. As long as we've got a flat around the outside edge, it'll register properly. So if you look at this now, there's still a little area that's down, but the majority of this is flat, and that's good enough. I do recommend getting a diamond plate. I got these from Japanese Tools here in Australia. These are the Atoma plates. I bought this with the grit on the front and the aluminium substrate, and I found them to be just as good as the DMT plates. I'm going to move on to the cap iron or chip breaker and the blade, and you can see I'm still using that same piece of 120 grit sandpaper. I've still got this one piece of 240, and you can pretty much get through an entire plane with just a small one. It depends how rusted it is and if you used vinegar or not, but if you're just going with sandpaper, usually one small square is enough. Don't forget the edges of the cap iron and the blade. It'll be rusty, so you just want to clean that back as well. After you've done that, when you're coming back with the 240 grit, just remember to catch these sharp edges just so they're smooth to the touch. And where we've got these rounded edges here, it's rounded, just roll. So hold it on the flat and just roll it round till you meet the flat on the other side, and you'll get that as well. So now we've done that, just back to a bit of 240, and just take to those sharper edges, and that's that cleaned up. Now it's the exact same process on the blade, so I'm not going to bore you with that. So I finished cleaning the blade up. It's not perfect, but after it's all cleaned, I'll give it a wipe down with metho, and once everything's done before I put it together, and then I'll give it a polish with the polishing compound as well. Now we're moving on to the screws and all the other parts to clean them up. So the honing paste on there, a bit of steel wool, cleans it up quite nicely, makes it a little bit shiny. It's more just taking the tarnish off rather than shining it right up. So I'll do that on all the parts, and on some of them I'll just use a strop with a bit of leather compound on it that I use for stropping my hand plate blades and chisels. That works well for the flat items. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to tape all these areas up, including just up to the edge here. So the paint will come over the top of these ridges and right down into all of these areas. We don't want any paint on these surfaces here because it could hinder the movement of the frog. So what I'm going to do is we'll tape these up. We'll just roll some tape into these threads to keep the paint out of all of these thread areas. And we'll just get some tape in through the mouth here onto this flat piece here where the frog sits, and we'll whack some tape up here as well. And so we'll tape all through these outside edges and allow the paint on these top rounded pieces. On some planes you'll see that these are kept clear, but the tops of these are rounded, and as I understand, these planes with these rounded parts had the Japanning come up over the top, so we're going to mimic that. Before I tape this up, I just want to show you that this is the paint I use. It's a Dupy color and in enamel with black. It can go up to 500 degrees Celsius. It's spray painting engine parts. And I found that it actually matches the black Japanning color perfectly. It's not too shiny, it's a little bit of a matte color. And I find it works really well. It's also got a great little spray applicator on here, which is better than the standard white ones. And as always, safety. I recommend you wear gloves because you don't want that paint getting all over your hands. And of course, use a respirator. You don't want to breathe any of this paint in. I also recommend not doing it on your workbench. You can if you cover everything up, but there's always a fine mist that seems to make it off. So I'm going to set up a little temporary cardboard spray booth outside. But first, the tape I'm going to be using is the blue painter's tape. I find it works better than the white stuff. And it's all about just getting it on here and then cutting it back and making sure there's no gaps. So a nice sharp knife is good for just slicing it off and making sure that it's all neat and tidy and there's no little gaps. Because if you have little gaps, especially around the mouth, you really want to make sure that tape's pushed down nice and well, because otherwise I've had the paint seep out before It's not such a big deal because we're still going to flatten this afterwards, but I prefer to not let that happen. Maybe bringing this tape through, because as well as keeping the paint off there, we don't really want any paint on the back of the mouth here. So I run this down here, rub it down nice, good, bring it through, then on top of it just to make sure that it's well covered. And to avoid any of that painting seepage that I was telling you about. And when you're doing this taping, make sure you've wiped it all down and cleaned all the rust dust out of the way. You don't want to getting any rust in this. Take your time, make sure you do this process right, and the end result will be much better. You can see painter's tape in here, filling these holes on these areas and just down here on the mouth. And you can see how I've got really good coverage right round the whole plane. And I've gone around and made sure it's really pushed down. You want to make sure it's very well stuck, because we're going to be leaving it on there until the paint is dry. So I would normally do that and wait till the next day. If we're in winter or it's quite moist or you can tell that it's not dry, just leave it until it's dry. Now that the plain base has been painted and while that's drying, I'm going to work on the handles. Now the traditional finish that they'd put on these handles and totes for the metal hand planes is shellac. And this has definitely got shellac on it. It's all split and peeled like shellac does when it gets old and dry. So the best thing I've found is an old chisel that's got sharpish edges. It acts like a little scraper, and we just use that to go around the entire handle and just scrape all the old finish off. It's a little bit of glue here. Just going to pop that off too. For those of you who don't know, shellac is the extract of a beetle found in India, I believe, that's diluted in alcohol, so methylated spirits or denatured alcohol. So now that I've scraped the majority of that off, what I'm going to do is get some steel wool, just some fine steel wool, and use a bit of methylated spirits and give it a rub down just to make sure all the old stuff is removed, and it'll loosen any of the rest of it up. And then just a quick wipe down with a rag with the front knob. It's the same process. And the reason I like a nice thin chisel is you can just scrape through any of the shaping on it really easy. So now we've taken all the old shellac off, it's time to put some new shellac on them. And what I have here is it's just a bit of leftover amber shellac, and in there I've added leather dye. What I do is just pour that out, and I use a Hague brush here. So this is a natural bristled brush made of goat hair. Painters use them with watercolors, and it works very well for the shellac. Any natural fibre brush works very well with the shellac and gives a good finish. Now with this, I'm looking to put a very, very, very thin coat on. This is a very thin cut of shellac as well. So what I'll do is get a little bit on the brush, tap it off like this, and then run it around the bottom and the outside edges. That's now my wet part of it. Then I'll run the brush across the top like that, and then I've got some cable ties here, so I'll run a cable tie through it. Just be careful not to get it everywhere, and then you run from wet side to wet side. And that helps to prevent any of those wet marks. It's a very forgiving finish. And this first coat's going to dry really quickly. What I'm going to do is just grab a clip here, just clip it up here on the cable tie. Bottom to top. Now I don't mind if I get this on my hands. It cleans up pretty easily with a bit of alcohol. But if you are worried, just use some gloves. Now I'm just going to let that sit here because this base is not going to be seen. So I'll just let that dry there. And as you can see here, this is almost completely dried because of how thin the coat is. So I'm going to go ahead and apply a second coat. Just hang them both up like that. I'll let them dry for about an hour or so, come back, put a third coat on it, and then I'll let it dry till the next morning. As you can see, it gives a nice shine, this paint, but it's not a very high gloss. Sort of like a satin gloss, which is a bit how the Japanning looks like to me. I'm happy with it. You can see that we got pretty good detail in around the lettering here. Now I'll go ahead and start peeling the tape off. Now I usually work from the top down when taking this tape off. Find you just peeling away from the paint. It's a moment of truth, and I always like this stage where you start to reveal what it's like. Just enough till I can grab it. That's how you paint the sole of a plane. It's pretty straightforward, doesn't need to be difficult, and with a little bit of attention to detail, the plane looks a lot better than it did before. And you've got to be pretty happy with that. So now we've got the body ready, we've got the handles up here with the finish that's all dry. I did add a third coat, as I said, of shellac to them, so you can see they've come up quite shiny. The shellac coating's still a little uneven, and that's where the steel wool with paste wax comes in. Add a bit of paste wax to these handles. You're not looking to put too much pressure on, just put a little bit of wax around and just help even coatings out. That's the point of using the steel wool on here. Now that we've done the handles, we're ready to put the whole plane together, and then we'll flatten the bottom. I flatten the bottom last because it removes any little bits of paint that have come through from when you've painted, and when you put the whole plane back in under tension, it can flex the base a little bit, so we want to flatten it once the whole thing's together and under tension with the blade retracted. So I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to use just some of this light machine oil I've got here, daub in each of the screw holes as I put it back together, that will just make sure that there's no rust inside the holes and that you can always take it apart easily. Now, turning this nut up here will actually screw the thread further into the cast iron body. Cap iron up. And we'll line it up and rock it until it sits here. And the adjuster is actually moving it. And we'll come in and we'll put the cap iron on. So these cap irons are designed to rotate off the screw here. So if it's too hard, back the screw off. You want it to come down with a nice bit of firmness, but you don't want it to be too hard. So that's a little too hard for my liking. I'm going to back it off another tiny turn. So I don't know if you can hear that, but it's a very positive click sound, but it's not too hard. What I've got here is a piece of melamine, and I find that it stays flat enough to flatten the bottom of these planes, and I've never had a problem, so that's what I use. I've got some 120 grit sandpaper here. After that's done, you can move on if you feel like it to some 240. Now, with these, we want them to be flat as much as we can in front, a good section behind the mouth, and at least some sections down the side. Now, the whole thing doesn't have to be dead flat for them to operate properly, but it's nice the more you get. So what I do to ensure it is I get a marker, some straight lines right across, concentrate by the mouth where you definitely want it flat, right the way down, and then up, you're making a little grid pattern. So what we can do is we can take a few passes and see where we need to remove it, and we'll see how long it's going to take. What I'll do is I'll just take a couple of passes. And so we can see it's coming off up here, coming off here, coming off right behind the back of the mouth, which is good. And we've got these streak lines right the way through, so it looks like it's pretty flat. So I'll do a few more passes, continually moving it across the page so we're evenly wearing the grit on the sandpaper. So now we can see there's only a little bit of gap here. We're getting it down here. We've got it mostly there, so most of this area is flat down here. So we're going to go a little bit further. The lines are off the side here. Looks like we're going to have a little flat spot here, but we'll continue another few strokes and keep having a look. And just push it down. So just here, I've got my hand right at the base, pushing down there, and I'm holding right over and keeping my fingers down on the front. And so we can see this is looking pretty shiny now. Got it flat most of the way through. There's still some deeper lines in here from the previous use of it, which doesn't really matter. We can go further and take a little bit more of that out. But what I like to do is now I've got here is mark it again. Sort of like a double check. We're just making sure that what we've seen is correct. So, I don't know if you can see it on here. There's still some faint marker lines just here. It's only there, a little bit there. It's a little faint line through here. A little one here and a little one there, but the rest of this is all good right the way around. Now, one last thing we're going to do is we'll just roll these edges on the paper slightly. Now, this front bit's already done, so I won't do that. But you just roll them so these sharp edges don't dig in. So now I've lightly rolled those edges, I'm going to grab... You can lie 240 down and do it this way if you really wanted to. I usually just grab a little bit, just rub it across the surface, just like this. If you really want to, you can come back in again with a little bit of turmeric paste. This is not necessary, but it's a good way to protect it from rusting further. Do that. Get yourself a bit of 4/0 steel wool. Just give it a rub. And then we just get that cloth. Buff it out. And there you go. Doesn't look new, looks restored, but it's no longer rusty, and it's ready for you to use it. So there you have it, folks. That's how you restore a hand plane. Well, a metal hand plane anyway.